this paper for you and for Dundonald Castle this evening. Tonight's paper is going to try and offer some insight into the attitudes of the Scottish political community towards chivalry and warfare in the reign of Robert II, which, as Blythe pointed out, began on the 22nd of February, so 2 months' time, in 2 weeks' time, sorry, 1371, so 650 years, not this Monday, but next. As I'm sure you were all aware before you came here, Robert built Dundonald Castle, spent a great deal of time there, died there in 1390. So it is a real pleasure to be presenting about him, his life, and Scottish political society during his reign for the Friends of Dundonald Castle. I will just very quickly and seamlessly here share my PowerPoint, or I hope quickly and seamlessly. There we go. Now, when modern audiences encounter the word chivalry, I think we tend to view it in terms of a fairly rigid set of principles, a code, if you like, that regulated the lives of knights. Chivalry is usually assumed to dictate that a knight should be courageous, a skillful warrior, godly, willing to put himself in jeopardy to defend the church, women, and the weak. The term might conjure images of King Arthur and his knights, whether in the form of 12th and 13th century French romances, or more contemporary interpretations. Often, actually, I think we tend to draw on preconceptions that are largely based on Victorian myth-making. So perhaps we might picture something akin to a pre-Raphaelite painting filled with wan damsels looking longingly as their knightly loves ride off to slay dragons, or seek the Holy Grail or some other mythic quest. However, the way the concept was understood in the medieval period was somewhat different. Dragons and holy grails were fairly thin on the ground in 14th and 15th century Europe. Now, broadly speaking, the scholarly debate surrounding chivalry has been framed by the works of two historians, Maurice Keane and Richard Kuiper. Now, Keane, writing in 1984, offered a conception of chivalry as, and I quote, an ethos in which martial, aristocratic, and Christian elements were fused together. For Keane, chivalry provided the nobles of medieval Europe with a framework through which they could exercise through which their exercise of authority was not only justified but sanctified. Ooh. Sorry, did you guys lose me there for a sec? Now, overall, Keane, having stressed this notion, the sort of sanctification of knighthood through this kind of overarching but quite nebulous concept of chivalry, overall, Keane saw chivalry as an attempt, largely but not exclusively driven by the church, to restrain the violent tendencies of medieval European warriors, with varying degrees of success. Kuiper, however, writing in 1999, challenged Keane's contention that chivalry had an essentially civilizing influence on medieval aristocratic society, and argued instead that chivalry merely provided a veneer of respectability to the violent means through which medieval aristocrats pursued their ambitions. Now, I don't want to get dragged too much into this particular debate, but I bring it up because it provides us, for the purposes of this talk, I think, with a broad working definition of chivalry on which to base our discussion, which I think is removed at least a little bit from some of the preconceptions that we as modern audiences tend to have. Regardless of the impact you think that chivalry had on medieval society, or the purpose that you think that it served, Chivalry is best understood very simply as an idealized conception of the role and responsibilities associated with knighthood. The specifics of what precisely this entailed would necessarily vary depending on the place that a work was written, when it was written, and who it was written for. The modern analogy I like to use is that the term chivalry in a medieval context was used very similarly to the way decency is used in the modern world. So, I don't want to get too wildly political here, but if you took a group of modern political leaders from a range of different parties, from a range of different countries, and you asked them whether they stood for decency, I would imagine that 100% of them would insist that, yes, indeed, they did. But if you looked at the policies that they offered, the behaviors that they indulged in, and so forth, the people that they mixed with, the support that they sought, you would find actually that their definition of decency varied wildly, despite the fact that all of them would insist that they were indeed the decent candidate or the candidate for decency. The same is very much true of chivalry. We see the term being used a lot. Nobody is anti-chivalry as such in the medieval world, but what precisely a given writer means may vary wildly compared to what another given writer might insist chivalry means. Now that brings us, I think, quite neatly to the central question of tonight's discussion, which is, how was knighthood idealized? How was chivalry understood in the reign of Robert II? Now, to answer that question, we should probably have a quick look at Robert himself. Now, Robert was already in his mid-50s when he became king in 1371, 650 years ago. That is as old or older than his grandfather, King Robert I, Robert the Bruce, if you prefer, was when he died in 1329. Thus, Robert II was already an established figure within the community of the realm at the time he became king, with a long and actually somewhat checkered career behind him. Robert was born at some point between 1315, when his mother was as yet unmarried, and 1318, when his mother was described as the Lady Marjorie of honourable memory, that is, dead. Probably he was born in 1316, and he was the only surviving son of a marriage between Walter Stewart and Marjorie Bruce, the eldest daughter of Robert the Bruce. He was actually identified by name as Bruce's heir presumptive in an entail concerning the succession of the crown in December 1318. You can see that there on the screen. Although his status was reduced slightly by the birth of the future King David II in 1324, the younger Robert was probably mentioned again by name as David's heir presumptive in a now lost entail produced in 1326. Though he would still only have been in his late teens when the Second War of Scottish Independence broke out in 1333, the conflict provided plenty of opportunity to develop a respectable martial reputation for the young Robert. Furthermore, the enforced absences of his nephew, that is King David, from 1333 to 1341, and again from 1346 until 1357, also gave Robert the chance to flex his muscles as an administrator. He served as guardian of the realm on several occasions, jointly from 1333 to 1335, solo from 1338 to 1341, and again solo for almost the entirety of David's captivity in England from 1346 and 1357. This won't all just be a list of years, I promise, guys, but for some of this biographical detail, it is, I promise, insignificant. Now, his role in maintaining the integrity of the Scottish kingdom and ensuring the survival of the Bruce dynasty may have endeared him to large sections of the community, but it earned him a degree of suspicion and indeed even hostility from his nephew, the king. David II's overriding ambition throughout his personal reigns was to reassert royal authority over those magnates who had expanded their influence and landed interests in his absence, and Robert was chief among those magnates. Robert, for his part, probably felt that the extension of his personal interests was a reasonable reward for the service that he had provided to the crown in David's absence. And he almost certainly felt that the king was being unreasonable by not ratifying those gains. The tensions between the two men found expression in the chronicle tradition, a fact best illustrated by Robert's contested role at the Battle of Neville's Cross, which happened in 1346. At Neville's Cross, or the Battle of Durham as it was originally known, David II was captured, wounded and captured, I may add, and a substantial portion of the Scottish nobility were either killed or imprisoned alongside him. Robert, though, escaped. For Walter Bower, a chronicler writing in the 1420s, by which time the status of the Stuart dynasty was well established, Robert's escape from the battlefield was a prudent withdrawal. It ensured the survival of the Scottish kingdom in the absence of its captive king. For John of Forden, however, writing in the 1360s, when tensions between David and Robert were still very much a live issue, Robert's flight and subsequent governance of the realm were far less a cause for celebration, as you can hopefully tell by his judgment on, or his careful lack of judgment on Robert's performance as guardian in the quote provided there. Now, in the years following King David's release from English captivity, the king's desire to thwart Stuart ambitions, Robert's ambitions, manifested most sharply in a pursuit of a lasting peace deal with the English crown based on the formal recognition of an English royal as David's successor. This is a move that would have essentially cut Robert out of the succession altogether. Now, generally speaking, the Treaty of Berwick, which formally ended the Second War of Scottish Independence in 1357, favoured the English over the Scots. Not only did it commit the Scots to paying a whopping 100,000 marks as a ransom for the return of the king, or that is paying over a period of 10 years, it also ceded a pretty substantial parcel of land in southern Scotland, including large swathes of Berwickshire, Teviotdale and Annandale. Now, what you're about to see, ladies and gents, is a very, very rough map illustrating those areas ceded. There are much better maps out there. Unfortunately, the sources that I would normally go to for them, I am separated from due to current pandemic circumstances. So I had to sort of improvise, as you'll see. My historical knowledge is much better than my art and geography, for that matter. Now, Robert and his allies initially, at least, did defend the Treaty of Berwick, but this was really a short-term response intended only to protect Robert's place in the line of succession from David's efforts to negotiate that new peace deal that would have designated an English heir. Once David had reconciled himself with the probability of a Stuart succession, and this seems to have occurred around 1366, 1367, and particularly, of course, after Robert became king in 1371, Scotland's primary foreign policy aim was the recovery of the territory it had lost in 1357. Now, as I say, you see the beginnings of this in David's reign, but you see it really kicking in a big way during Robert's. Older historians, or older histories, I suppose, have tended to downplay Robert's role in directing the recovery of this lost territory. More recently, however, the historian Alistair MacDonald has convincingly argued that the level of sophistication and cooperation in the activity of Scottish marchers, at the very least, suggests that the Crown not only approved, but also actively coordinated their efforts to reoccupy the so-called English Pale. The English Pale is the term used for that sort of occupied area in southern Scotland. Now, when challenged by the English royal administration over the actions of his southern subjects in undermining English authority in that English Pale, Robert repeatedly pleaded that this was the work of his overmighty magnates, to borrow a 16th century phrase there. Magnates who are acting without his authorization and out with his control. You can see the sort of rogues gallery of who some of those magnates were up on the screen. Now that claim, that plea of Robert's that this was his overmighty magnates, this was merely a handy excuse designed to absolve the Scottish Crown of responsibility for attacks on English officials and nominal English subjects in the contested areas. And of course, it also ensured that any English recriminations for these assaults remained localized. They remained directed only at individual southern magnates and not at the kingdom as a whole. This strategy of conducting small-scale but coordinated attacks to wear down resistance to Scottish royal authority in the disputed areas, while simultaneously seeking to avert the risk of large-scale English retaliation, this was absolutely central to the conduct of foreign policy during the reign of Robert II, and was surely born out of his own personal experiences of the previous 5 decades of Anglo-Scottish conflict. Robert seems to have been, for example, one of the only Scottish lords to have escaped the carnage at the Battle of Halidon Hill in 1333. And he would have remembered how in the wake of this crushing defeat, the English crown had been able to intrude its military power even into the northern parts of Scotland, and did so for much of the rest of that decade. Avoiding a repeat of this was critical to the success of early Stuart foreign policy, and thus necessitated a cautious balance to be struck in the Scots' approach to border warfare during this period. And again, Alistair MacDonald's in-depth analysis of Scottish military activity in this period bears this out: periods of intense activity and then judiciously negotiated truces that kind of keep the heat off the Scots, particularly at moments when the things are quiet on the continent or things are quiet domestically in England, and the English crown has time and space and resources that they could otherwise direct towards Scotland. We would, of course, expect this approach to warfare to find expression in the literature of the period, much as the tensions between Robert and David in the 1360s were reflected in the work of Forden and Bower. And we would expect this approach to warfare to have an impact on how Scottish audiences understood and idealized the roles and responsibilities of knighthood. This brings us neatly onto Barbour's Bruce. Now, John Barbour was Archdeacon of Aberdeen from 1356 until his death in 1395. Unfortunately, for people like me who study him and his work, many of the details about Barbour's life are sadly obscure. But we can be sure that he had a long and lucrative association with Robert II. Sorry. Barbour, for example, served King Robert as an auditor of the Exchequer on 5 separate occasions between 1373 and 1385. He was granted a £1 annuity from the crown in 1378, a sum that was increased to £10 in 1388. And he continued to receive occasional one-off gifts of cash from the crown in the intervening years. Sorry. In the grant of 1378, King Robert described Barbour as delecto clerico nostro, that is, our beloved clerk. And in 1429, the cathedral chapter at Aberdeen, who continued to receive Barbour's annuity even after his death, claimed that it had originally been given, and I quote, for the compilation of the Book of Deeds of the late King Robert the Bruce. Although only the Bruce survives to us, Barbour seems to have written at least 1, possibly 3 Stuart genealogies, suggesting that he had a strong connection to the family. Now, this obvious association between Barbour and King Robert, coupled with the claims of the cathedral chapter in the early 15th century, has historically led to an assumption that Robert directly commissioned Barbour's work. There are some debates around that. Unfortunately, I don't have time to get into them in this paper, but I would very much welcome anyone to ask in the Q&A if anyone is interested in some of the reasons why it's a good idea to think that Robert was paying Barbour and why maybe somebody else was pulling the strings. But we can at least be confident to attributing Barbour's Bruce to the early years of Robert II's reign. Barbour himself dates the compiling of the work to the year of grace 1375, that is 1375. Now, the Bruce itself is a long narrative poem recounting the lives and adventures of Robert II's grandfather, King Robert I, Robert the Bruce, and the good Sir James Douglas. Douglas was a minor Lanarkshire nobleman who became one of the leading magnates in southern Scotland through faithful and ruthlessly effective service in war to the Bruce regime during the period about 1306-1307 through to his own death in service in war to the Bruces in 1330. The work itself defies easy categorization. It blends elements of romance, of exemplar, even of national history. But by focusing on the lives of two of Scotland's most renowned and successful war leaders, Barbour's work necessarily explores questions of proper knightly behaviour. Given his connections to the court of Robert II, and the fact that the poem remained well known with literate Scots well into the early modern era, we can reasonably suppose that his observations on the subject resonated with the late 14th century noble audience for which it was produced. By considering Barbour's treatment of his heroes and their actions, we can begin to build up an impression of how the Scottish aristocracy, and indeed the wider nobility, conceptualized the role of knighthood in the formative years of the Stuart dynasty. Now, critical to understanding Barbour's thoughts on chivalry is the term worship. Worship, an older Scots word meaning worth, honour, high reputation. Happily, Barbour provides for us a direct and fairly succinct digression on the meaning of the very term. His commentary on worship comes in the context of an almost certainly fictional episode in which Bruce defends a ford alone against 200 men. Now, at first, this might seem like a pretty fanciful, even superhuman effort on Bruce's part. But Barbour is at pains to outline the practical considerations that the king faces ahead of this encounter and the tactical preparations he makes in order to accomplish this feat. For instance, the poet tells us that Bruce scouted along the burn on either side of the ford to make sure that the ford was the only place where anyone could cross. He also notes that the ford is so narrow that only 2 men can cross at a time, limiting the number of foes that Bruce is going to have to deal with at any given moment. The author goes on to inform us that when he learned of the coming attack, Bruce sent the 2 young attendants who were with him off to find the nearby camp of the rest of his men. This Bruce would only have to hold the ford for a certain time. He wouldn't have to deal with all 200 of these guys, just hold them off long enough till the rest of the gang got there. Barbour notes that Bruce was warnest of arming, that is, wearing armour, and this would protect him from arrows and force his opponents to cross the ford and face him at close quarters. When the assault begins, Barbour has Bruce kill the first man's horse, further blocking the narrow ford and making it more difficult for his foes to reach him. Barbour immediately follows the defense of the ford with a comparison to a similar story from the Roman de Thebes, which is almost certainly where Barbour has lifted the model for this story from. But he then launches into an explanation of how honour is prized, how worship is prisoned. And he elaborates on precisely what he means by this term. Barbour states categorically that it is to be wise in their deeds that causes men to win the prize of worship, of honour. You'll find one of the key phrases here in the PowerPoint. None may have honour if he does not have wit or intelligence to steer his deeds and show him what options to leave and what options to take. Now, according to Barbour, this use of wit, this emphasis on WYT, wit, intelligence, shrewdness. This is absolutely crucial. According to Barbour, worship or worthiness occupies a midpoint between two extremes, foolhardiness and cowardice. Foolhardiness seeks to undertake any action presented, no matter how unlikely it is to result in a positive outcome. Cowardice, on the other hand, refuses to act at all, which Barbour concedes is actually even a more serious failing than foolhardiness. But for Barbour, worship, honor, high reputation is the mean between the two. Hardiment that mellet mixed with wit is worship. Throughout the entire poem, we see this theme of boldness guided by intelligence as one of the cardinal virtues a knight can display. The poet makes it clear, for instance, that Bruce's willingness to achieve his aims umquile with strength and quile with slicht or slight, that is cunning, is crucial to his ultimate success, not just in individual cases, but also to his success as a whole, his success in this national history that Barbour is recounting. Barbour makes frequent comparisons between Robert and his brother, Edward Bruce. And while Barbour is not exactly stinting in his praise for Edward Bruce, he is explicit in his judgment that Robert Bruce was the superior of the brothers, because Edward Bruce was rash, where Robert allowed his courage to be led or governed by his wit. This trait is not only found in Bruce, I should say, but it is also reflected in another of the poem's heroes, or the poem's other hero, if you will, James Douglas. And it has to be said, Douglas, in some senses, actually outstrips Bruce as the hero of the poem, certainly in places. Some, maybe all of you, will be familiar with the film Outlaw King. And you might remember a particular episode in it, a brutal moment. It's known as the Douglas Larder, in which Douglas, played by Aaron Taylor Johnson in the film, ambushes the garrison of his family's castle while they're in a church, drags them back to the castle, kills them all, and burns the place down. Well, that actually comes from the Bruce. The Bruce is the only source, actually, that we have for the Douglas Larder. And if anything, it is more brutal and bloodthirsty in the Bruce than it is in the film, if you can believe it. But Barbour doesn't treat this as some sordid moment in Douglas's life to be embarrassed about or to have explained away. Rather, he presents it in the same terms as Bruce's defense of the ford, a pragmatic response to a desperate situation in which Douglas drew on his knightly qualities to achieve success. Unable to contend, in this case, with his enemies with even might, Douglas determines that he will proceed with slight, with slicht. Similar to the incident, the ford, Barbour is keen to detail the tactical considerations Douglas faces. His inability to hold the castle, the lack of supplies and men, the unlikelihood that if he does stay in the castle, that he'll be rescued by the rest of the Scots. All of this contextualizes this ruthlessness and puts into perspective, justifies his destruction of the stronghold. Douglas's willingness to be guided by his wit and his ability to discern when to run and when to fight is further demonstrated by Barbour's claim that while operating out of Jedworth Forest in southern Scotland, Douglas scored 57 victories over the English and escaped them 13 times. You'll see that quote at the bottom of the screen there. Towards the end of the poem, when Douglas is recognised by a young English squire, Robert Ogle, during an engagement in Weardale, it is for Douglas's place, that is tricks, that Ogle claims Douglas should be feared. Later in the same passage, Barbour contrasts the bold but foolhardy attitude of Bruce's nephew, Thomas Randolph, Earl of Murray, with the wiser and more cautious Douglas, who convinces Murray to lead the Scottish army out of Weardale under cover of darkness, that is, rather than risk a full-scale battle with the English forces. More generally, Barbour invariably sets out the tactical challenges facing the Scots before an engagement, and details the ways in which the Scottish leaders overcome these challenges through prudent planning. Again, those of you familiar with Outlaw King may remember the climactic battle scene at Loudon Hill, where the Scots used a series of trenches to funnel the English into a narrow space where the superior numbers mean nothing. Well, again, that comes from Barbour's Bruce. Barbour turns the encounter at Loudon Hill into a dry run of sorts for the Battle of Bannockburn, some 7 years later. Now, Barbour's emphasis on the wit of his protagonists. This is particularly interesting when considered in the context of what we discussed earlier about Anglo-Scottish relations in the reign of Robert II. After all, this cautious, calculated approach was the guiding principle of Robert II's foreign policy, which required Scottish war leaders to be able to judge what could be reasonably accomplished with the resources at their disposal, and of course, to restrain their activities at appropriate moments in order to avoid major English reprisals. In presenting his characters as masters of this type of prudent warfare, and explicitly associating this with their worthiness as knights, Barbour simultaneously provides a literary endorsement for Robert II's approach to Anglo-Scottish relations, and encourages his audience to adopt attitudes and behaviours best suited to facilitating this policy. Now, it's not only in the context of martial activities that we see Barbour reflecting on the particular concerns of his time. Another of the overriding themes in the Bruce is the subject of loyalty. Loyalty was an issue of acute anxiety for the Scottish crown during periods of Anglo-Scottish conflict, not least because Scotland had a smaller population, and thus any loss of manpower through defection further undermined the ability of the Scottish realm to effectively defend itself from its southern neighbour. At its most basic level, the material rewards of service to the English crown were generally greater than those of service to the Scottish crown, since the English crown was wealthier and had more resources to draw upon. Furthermore, in areas where the English could easily extend their military power, often the English crown was better placed to guarantee the safety of an individual's property than the Scottish crown was. In this case, a landowner might find it more beneficial, more practical to side with the English over the Scots. Robert II himself was not immune to this kind of pressure during his time as a magnate. In 1335, with the Bruce regime very much on the back foot in the Scottish War of the Second War of Scottish Independence, and the English having proved capable of conducting armed attacks deep into the northeast and up the west coast of Scotland, where most of Robert's interests lay, Robert made peace with the English-backed candidate for the kingship of Scotland, Edward Balliol, only briefly, I might add. The process of reclaiming those areas of southern Scotland surrendered in 1357, which we mentioned earlier, of course, was one of Robert's key policy aims. In practical terms, this process simply meant extending Scottish military power back into the disputed regions, largely through raiding, and convincing the major landowners there that the Scottish crown could better protect their rights and their property than the English crown, luring the major landowners back into Scottish allegiance. Thus, maintaining existing ties of loyalty among the Scottish nobility and drawing former adherents of the crown back into Scottish allegiance was absolutely central to achieving Robert II's goals in the 1370s. Surprise, surprise, we find this reflected in the text of the Bruce. For Barbour, loyalty was the most important virtue for a knight. Without loyalty, he states, a man cannot be said to be good, even if he is brave or wise. When heaping praise on Bruce's nephew, Thomas Randolph, Earl of Murray, Barbour notes that he loved loyalty and always stood against treason, falsehood, and felony. Similarly, in his eulogy for Douglas towards the end of the poem, Barbour again highlights his love of loyalty and insists that he could not be in the presence of a known traitor without punishing them. While Barbour is at pains to stress the loyalty of his heroes, he also seeks to emphasize the treacherous nature of his villains. For instance, Barbour claims that Bruce's rival, John Comyn, breached an indenture he had made to assist Bruce to become King of Scots. And while the poet does admit that Bruce misdid by killing him in a church, he leaves no room for doubt that Comyn deserved to die for his betrayal. The anniversary of that particular incident, Bruce's killing of Comyn, was actually yesterday, funnily enough. On 4 separate occasions over the course of the poem, Barbour relates incidents in which Bruce finds himself facing off against a trio of assassins, who he, of course, fights and overcomes. Once he is attacked by the Macnadorsay brothers. He is attacked again in the wake of the Douglas larder. He is attacked yet again while he's on the run with his foster brother in Carrick, and then once more afterwards while hunting again in his native Carrick. On that last instance, he's actually rescued by his dog, sweetly. In all but the first of these 4 episodes, Barbour identifies the perpetrators as traitors. And in the second and fourth incidents, including the one with the dog, he is explicit in his judgment that it was the treason of these men that led to their destruction. Many of the early Scottish failures in the Bruce are attributed to treachery. For instance, it is a disciple of Judas and false traitor named MacNab who facilitates the capture of Dundonald Castle in 1306, which results in the capture and execution of Bruce's beloved brother-in-law, Crystal or Christopher Seaton. Similarly, Kildrummy Castle falls to the English after a man named Hosbarn or Osborne treacherously starts a fire to distract the garrison, this time leading to the capture and execution of Bruce's brother, Neil. As in the case of the concept of worship, Barbour places an extended digression on the dangers of treason immediately after his account of the fateful confrontation between Bruce and Comyn at Greyfriars Kirk in 1306. He cites examples of celebrated figures from history, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, King Arthur, all of whom Barbour assures us were brought low by treachery. Now, Barbour's discourses on loyalty throughout the Bruce serve as a direct warning to his audience on the threat that disloyalty poses to the chances of Scottish success in future Anglo-Scottish conflict. Barbour does not, however, believe that one's loyalty to the Scottish crown should be unconditional. And in doing so, he demonstrates a keen understanding of political theory in the 14th century. Lordship, in a medieval context, was supposed to be reciprocal in nature. A superior would expect faithful service from their inferiors, but in return, those inferiors would be, the superior rather, would be required to generously reward his followers for their fealty. If either party failed in these responsibilities, the other was justified in annulling the relationship altogether. And I realized there, I said he. That is true of female lordship, as we refer to it in scholarly terms. Women who were lords were expected to behave in very much the same way. Now, nowhere is this reciprocal nature of lordship better exemplified in the Bruce than in the friendship between Robert Bruce and James Douglas, the poem's 2 heroes. We should probably note here that friendship in a medieval context does still have the same kind of internal and emotional value that we would understand it to have, but the term is also regularly used in a much more formal socio-political context, and the friendship between Bruce and Douglas mirrors both of these meanings. From the first time they meet, Barbour presents Bruce and Douglas as being the embodiment of this reciprocal form of lordship, as can be seen from the passage quoted here. The key feature of the relationship that Barbour chooses to highlight is that Douglas served Bruce loyally and Bruce rewarded him well for his service. Barbour reiterates this aspect of their friendship again when Douglas is chosen to take Bruce's heart on crusade as the king approaches death. Barbour has Douglas note the largesse and bounty, the generosity that the king has bestowed on him over the years. Douglas too is praised by Barbour on several occasions for his generosity. For example, following his victory over Sir Robert Neville near Berwick, which Barbour misdates to 1317, actually happened in 1319. The poet notes that he dispersed the booty taken from the defeated English among his followers while holding none for himself, keeping none for himself. Bruce, his the notion that he embodied perfect reciprocal lordship is reflected in an episode on the Isle of Arran, when a woman gives her 2 sons to Bruce in service, knowing that the king will reward them appropriately for their actions, for their service. Now, in his attitude to loyalty, and I'm getting close to the end here, folks, you'll be pleased to hear. In his attitude towards loyalty, we see Barbour once again tackling the reality facing the Scottish political community in the 1370s. The Stuart regime, still only in its infancy really, needed to secure the loyalty of the community at large, both to consolidate its domestic position and also to assert its authority over the direction of Robert II's foreign policy, as we discussed earlier. Whether we see Robert II as Barbour's patron or not, the poet's insistence that Robert's grandfather and namesake was the very model of good lordship must surely have been intended as a mirror for the king, encouraging him to embody these same principles. The great magnates of the south, meanwhile, had to lure the most influential figures in the areas still occupied by the English back into Scottish allegiance, and to prove that they, not the English crown, were best placed to offer them protection, leadership, and patronage. Barbour's writings on loyalty not only offer a model for accomplishing this, they also elevate the effort to achieve this end into nothing short of the pursuit of an ideal chivalric virtue. In other words, Barbour justifies the aims and ambitions of Robert II and the wider community by placing those goals in a wider framework of chivalric accomplishment. Now, we said at the start, and this really is, I promise, my last thought. We said at the start that the goal of this paper was to examine chivalry and warfare in the reign of Robert II. So just to wrap up, it seems appropriate to consider the question of what a knight should be like in Robert II's Scotland. Now, from Barbour's Bruce, I think we begin to formulate actually quite a specific answer to this question. In some senses, the results aren't surprising. You know, Barbour's knights are, as we said at the start, brave, strong, proficient in combat. They're reasonably pious. They're respectful of the church for the most part. They are protective of the women and that ill-defined group, the weak. But Barbour's knights are also cool and calculating in battle. They are able to quickly assess a situation and make smart decisions about how best to proceed in order to achieve victory. They are willing and able to employ subtle and inventive tactics to accomplish their aims, and they are prepared to run if it means they live to fight another day. Barbour's knights are fiercely loyal. But more than this, that loyalty proceeds from an understanding in principle of how good lordship works, and they practice good lordship with their own followers. In presenting his characters in these terms, Barbour is not merely expressing a personal preference for prudence, fidelity, and stable governance. He is reacting to the specific needs of the Scottish political community of his own time. The action in the Bruce reflects the practicalities of conducting a sustained and effective campaign in the Scottish marches, and justifies these activities by elevating the principles involved to the status of chivalric virtues. The poem encourages its readers to see themselves as a chivalric brotherhood, united around a Stuart dynasty that does not represent a new and still fragile political settlement achieved only with the death of David II on the 22nd of February 1371, but which traces its legitimacy directly to the struggles of Robert the Bruce and his lieutenants in the early 14th century. By stressing this sense of continuity, Barbour also appeals to Robert II himself to embody the principles his grandfather supposedly stood for. Barbour's Bruce then demonstrates that chivalry was a powerful uniting force in Scottish noble society during the reign of Robert II. It offered a means for the Scottish aristocracy to rationalise the struggle to restore the Anglo-Scottish border as it had been earlier in the century. It gave the community of the realm a sense of historically justified cohesion, and it provided the early Stuarts, such as Robert II, with a way to further legitimise their exercise of authority. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm not sure if you've noticed, but we've had a bit of a roaring conversation discussion going in the chat, so that is great. Ooh, and so there are already some questions going for you in the chat, some of which have been partially answered by a few of us. I think probably some names you'll be familiar with to begin with.
Yeah.
But let's see. Oh no, my chat box outside has disappeared. But first, yeah, thank you so much for that. That was absolutely fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
Let's go back. Sorry. Try and find the first one. So Rosie asked, Barbour seems very plausible. How much credence should we give him? And are the incidents recorded in Barbour also recorded anywhere else?
So that is a very good question. And it is the crucial question to ask, of course, whenever you're dealing with a medieval source. There is a lot of material in the Bruce that is attested elsewhere, and there is a lot of material in the Bruce that is not attested elsewhere, but we shouldn't dismiss because of that. Barbour is really a very early Scottish writer. The only sort of substantive bit of historical writing that survives to us from 14th century Scotland that is earlier is Forden's chronicle, and that has all sorts of issues surrounding it as well. But Barbour is almost certainly in some cases providing us with Scottish tradition, stories that he has heard from Robert II or from the sort of courtly circles that he moves in and so forth. So even the stuff that isn't attested elsewhere, but is in Barbour, we should take seriously. There is, however, also a lot of stuff that is guff. And he is not afraid to just make up a story. I mean, for example, I mentioned there are 4 times in the course of the poem where 3 treacherous guys, gang up on Bruce when he's out on his own in the woods, suspiciously away from his followers, or sometimes he has an attendant with him, or his dog, because he's out hunting, and these guys go for him and they think they're going to get him, and he beats them because he's great, or because their treason outdid them. And then at the end, we get a nice little wrap up where Bruce explains to the audience that this is this is because of their treason. Now, there are serious scholars out there who have tried to suggest that maybe 1 or maybe 2 of these are a real story. In all likelihood, though, looking at those, it just sounds like Barbour really likes that model. He likes the idea of the 3 rotten guys coming at Bruce out of the woods, him beating them, and then getting to turn the camera and say, stay in school, kids. So it is a very rich source, and there's lots and lots of good stuff in there. There's lots of, I mean, for example, I work at the Battle of Bannockburn Visitor Centre. It is the earliest Scottish account of the Battle of Bannockburn, detailed Scottish account. Forden basically mentions that it happened, but doesn't really give you any information whatsoever. Barbour goes into more detail than any other near contemporary writer about the Battle of Bannockburn, and includes a lot of stuff that isn't found anywhere else. He provides us with a description of the makeup of Bruce's division, the division that Bruce leads. He tells us that there's a cavalry engagement, that there's a Scottish cavalry division races off and drives some English archers from one side of the battlefield. That's not found anywhere else. And there are some people who say, well, it's not found anywhere. You know, not just people on the internet, but, you know, legitimate scholars who will argue that, oh, well, that's just Barbour making it up as he goes along. I would suggest that actually what we are seeing there is our first insight into how the Scots are telling this story. It's absurd to suggest that the Scots aren't telling the story of the Battle of Bannockburn to one another between 1314 and roughly 1375 when Barbour's writing. So that story's kind of got to come from somewhere. Maybe it's Keith's family tradition because it's Robert Keith that leads that cavalry, but you know, there are things in Barbour that are unique to Barbour that I think we should be cautious about saying, oh, well, nobody else mentions it, so it's just Barbour, there he goes off again. But there are also definitely some, you know, some whoppers that Barbour tells us. For the most part, I actually think on sort of close readings, you can normally tell, because like the incidents with the three traitors and Bruce winning them, they feel like literary inventions. The same thing I mentioned, that a woman giving her two sons in service to Bruce, that happens twice, and it is almost the same story happening over again. Well, you know, maybe it happened once and Barbour's just replicated it, but realistically it's probably just Barbour making it up, because it, you know, that doesn't really, you can cut that out of Bruce's life and it kind of doesn't matter. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't explain anything other than a kind of theme that Barbour is hammering. Whereas there are things in there that we don't find out anywhere else in Barbour, but they do have certain kind of historical explanatory power. And of course, he tells stories that we know a little bit more about from other sources, where it does seem that he's actually swinging the lead a bit, where he's adding something in to make Bruce look a little bit better than maybe he was. I hope that answers the question to some extent. Basically, we should trust Barbour on some bits and not trust Barbour on other bits.
That seems like the case for most chronicles.
Yeah.
So I should say, before we take the next question, anybody that wants to turn their cameras on, feel free. You don't have to, because we'll go through these questions that are in the chat box, and then we can do kind of chat box or raised hands once we're through these. So feel free to turn your camera on if you'd like. Preferably keep your mics muted unless you have a specific question, just to keep the noise down, because there's still 38 people here, so that's fantastic.
Thank you,
there were a couple answers to this one in the chat, but if we could kind of quickly get your take on this as well. Who asked this one? Caitlin asked, is the English Pale the same as the English or Scottish marches?
So they overlap very, very strongly. So the English Pale is the area occupied by the English after, well, occupied by the English mostly after the Battle of Neville's Cross in 1346, but more specifically the area that is ceded to the English after the end of the Second War of Scottish Independence. So 1357, the English royal administration is riding high on a big victory over the French at the Battle of Poitiers, at which quite a few Scots also serve, a sort of significant group of Scots anyway. And they're really eager to solidify that success and consolidate that success. So they won peace with France and they won peace with Scotland, and they strike a deal with the Scots that they'll give David back for this massive amount of cash, but they also want kind of a buffer zone between Scotland and England. They don't want it to be easy for the Scots to raid into Northumberland, Cumbria, the sort of northern counties of England. I'm actually from County Durham, which is just on the County Durham. I'm from a place called Shotley Bridge, rather, which is just on the border between County Durham and Northumberland. So Shotley Bridge burned down a couple of times by the Scots in the 1380s in Robert's reign, I might add. So to create this buffer zone, essentially the English say, well, we'll give you the king back, but we're not giving you any of the land back. And so there is a large part of Berwickshire in the east march, Teviotdale, which is kind of runs where Roxburgh is, and where Floors Castle is now, Hawick, that sort of area, and also Annandale, where Loch Maben is. So those areas, they haven't been recovered by the Scots yet, and the English say we're not giving them back. And at this point, the Scots accept this because they're not getting the king back any other way. And they too have kind of come to the realization that actually there's not much left to be gained by fighting with the English. The English can't really do much in terms of material damage to the Scots at the minute, but the Scots can't do very much in terms of material damage to the English, and there's a kind of war weariness all around. So that's where the English Pale comes from. It's those occupied areas. The Scottish marches are literally just the areas north of the border. So you have the East March covering kind of Berwickshire through to about kind of Hawick, Hawick, Selkirk area. You have the Middle March, which covers what used to be Ettrick Forest and Selkirk Forest, and then the West March, which is kind of Annandale, Nithsdale, and a kind of across into Galloway. So the English Pale is in the Scottish marches, if you see what I mean, and it's very much in the interests of the Scottish marcher lords to recover those areas, because it's them that the land's been taken from directly, and that the influence over those the kind of major landowners within the English Pale, who they've lost, but they're not quite synonymous. I hope that makes sense. I'm happy to try and explain that in a more clear way. If I sorry, was it Caitlin? If that seems to have just complicated things further, I'm more than happy to to try again. But yeah, the Scottish marches is just the land north of the border up to, say, about, Lothian isn't in the Scottish marches. It kind of, once you've hit that sort of Galloway, Selkirkshire, Roxburghshire, Berwickshire, that's your Scottish marches, roughly. And as I say, large parts of that are English from 1357 through to 1370s, 1380s. The process of reclamation's largely accomplished by about 1384, which is also when the English finally stopped believing Robert's excuses about, it's just my magnates running wild, and they actually come for Scotland in a big way. And we have 3-4 years, 5 years really, of quite intensive warfare that the Scots do pretty well on, still hold on to those areas even after that period of open war.
We have a question from Todd. Todd, I don't know if you want to unmute and ask, or I can just read it from the chat if you'd like.
No, it's all right. I can ask if you want, Blythe. Great presentation, Callum. It was just a quick one. We talk about chivalry and warfare, and Robert II, and probably more specifically his son, Alexander Stewart, the Wolf of Badenoch, were regularly using Cateran or Highland levies. And I'm just wondering how that kind of fit into the narratives with other kind of thinking around, chivalric kind of mode of warfare, and then using these Caterans to raid at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, so it is particularly interesting. I mean, I sort of mentioned briefly there Barbour's description of Bruce's division at Bannockburn. Now that's particularly interesting because it is described as being the army of Carrick, which, fair enough, he's the Earl of Carrick, but also the men of Argyll, Kintyre, and the Isles. So it is a kind of mixed unit. It kind of sits across the sort of English, Scots-speaking, Gaelic-speaking divide. And it's believable enough, knowing Bruce's background and his where he was from, but also how he had built up support over the years since 1306, that he would have this kind of mixed battalion. And Barbour seems to describe Bruce's division at the Battle of Byland in 1322 in very similar ways. It again seems to be part Highland, part Gaelic. Now, while it does seem believable enough that is the kind of motley crew, if you like, that Bruce himself would have been leading in 1314, it also reads very much like the sort of support you would expect Robert II to have. Like his grandfather, and very much unlike his nephew, Bruce's son, David II, Robert spans that gap between Gaelic Scotland and English Scotland, if you like, Scots Scotland, for want of a better word, very comfortably. He governs mostly from Perth and from Scone, which is much more central within Scotland than some of the areas where David had preferred to rule from, mostly from Edinburgh and from Fife. So I think actually, but certainly for Barbour, the Gaelic world, although he doesn't seem, as far as we can tell, to have had any Gaelic, certainly doesn't write in Gaelic, refers to Gaelic-speaking Scots as the Irishry, seemingly because he can't differentiate between Irish and Gaelic, as a lot of English-speaking Scots, or Scots-speaking Scots wouldn't have done. But even despite not moving in those cultural circles, it doesn't seem from the Bruce that Barbour would exclude Gaelic-speaking Scots from his kind of chivalric framework. That if, Gaelic speakers, if Caterans, if you like, operate in, are brave and strong and reasonably godly and prudent in the way they act on the battlefield and fiercely loyal, then actually they can be as chivalrous as the next guy. Certainly can possess worship. It's actually also interesting that and this is something I didn't really have time to talk about in the paper, Barbour is very, very unusual. One of the reasons why I think often he doesn't get categorized as a piece of chivalric literature in a more sort of broad sense, Barbour is quite happy to have low class heroes, what in sort of English works might be considered yeomen. For example, the Douglas larder, the plan is put together between Douglas and one of his tenants, a guy called Tom Dixon, a seemingly unknighted, unnoble individual, a son of a former constable of Edinburgh Castle. William Francis helps the Scots capture Edinburgh Castle in March 1314. So again, I hope hopefully this is actually addressing the question. I'm not just rabbiting on here. But I think for Barbour, there isn't necessarily such a contradiction between the use of caterans and the Wolf of Badenoch's famous exercise of coin. This very sort of ruthless and quite sort of violent Gallic form of lordship and chivalry. In his audience, I suspect Barbour isn't necessarily reflecting his audience very well in that case. Because, when you read, not so much Forden, but certainly when you hit Andrew of Winton and definitely Bower in the 1440s, Winton right in the 1420s, it is very clear that there are there are increasingly clear lines and a keen sense of otherness between Gaelic Scotland and non-Gaelic Scotland. Both Winton and Bower are resolutely English-speaking Lowland Scots, and they find the Highlands fascinating, but they do think that it's brutal and savage. And I mean, the quote that I always think of for Bower, when he's talking, he tries to explain why Highlanders are all so rough and ready and eager to fight. And he talks about, it's cold up there, so the blood is further away from their skin, and so you've got to cut them deeper to make them bleed, and that's why they don't mind fighting, because they don't get hurt as easily. So Barbour is probably not, but it is harder to say that Barbour's audience would necessarily agree with that. But certainly I don't think Barbour in the text draws any sense that Catherine's Gaelic, that the Gaelic cultural world is less chivalrous than the English-speaking world. I should just point out there is a lady, Joanna Richardson, doing a PhD at the moment on Barbour's Bruce, and particularly on Gaelic and Irish sort of identity reflected in Barbour's Bruce. So her work may very well prove me entirely wrong on that subject. She just started last year. So I personally am waiting with bated breath to hear what she has to say. I hope that kind of answers the question. Thank you.
Craig, I think you've said this kind of, he seems to have answered some of your question. I don't know if you want to ask the rest of your question or just ask your question, or I can read it out for you if you like.
Oh, I'll happily step up. I mean, I've answered half of it anyway, Callum, so thank you for being so broad with that. It's just that I also study a similar kind of field to you, in looking at kind of martial culture and chivalry, but I'm mostly looking at the reign of James IV to James VI, the kind of the beginning of the early modern period. So I look at later sources. But I was thinking to myself that, having looked at kind of and tried to compare chivalric texts from Lowland Scotland and a lot of the pageant poets from Gaelic Scotland, it seems to me that most of the martial culture, even in the 15th and 16th century, the same virtues are mostly espoused in both to a great extent. So there's always that question of how much of an impact does chivalry have on Gaelic Scotland, because lots of scholars like to think of it being two neat, tidy categories that now the twain shall meet. But I've always found that knighthood is less common and perhaps more honorific. But apart from that, even if the Gaels don't talk about chivalry, they have their own form of it, more or less, and it's pretty easy to say right now. But I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that particularly. But I think you've probably got plenty.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. It is always interesting to see how few Sir so-and-sos we get in, even in Lowland sources that are talking about Gaelic Scots. Often when it is mentioned that someone has been knighted, it's often the implication given is that they have consented to be knighted, if you see what I mean, and that this somehow is kind of bringing them into sort of or well, not necessarily bringing them into Lowland culture, but taking them out almost of Gaelic culture. And I have this is going to sound like a weird aside. I have a pal whose surname is Campbell, and my PhD supervisor was Steve Boardman, or one of my PhD supervisors was Steve Boardman, who literally wrote the book on the medieval Campbells, to try and dispel some of those myths surrounding the Campbells being these kind of non-Gallic interlopers in the Gallic world. So it's so Campbell, traditional Campbell histories kind of interested me quite a bit because of that. I know it's something that is often pointed out as Neil Campbell being one of Bruce's sort of close allies from early on. This notion that he is knighted somehow immediately, that he does style himself Sir Neil Campbell or Neil Campbell Knight. This is a sort of finger that's pointed at him, being saying like, oh, you see, this is how you can tell that he's alien, because he's happy to be a knight, and so many other of the sort of prominent Campbells that continue to be prominent supporters of the Stuarts, and Robert Stewart in particular, are these kind of alien interlopers, because they tend to refer to themselves as Sir. I mean, I think there always, when we talk about Gaelic Scotland, particularly in the 14th century and previous, and earlier, we're always dogged by a lack of sources. So very often the only thing that you have to go by is some, Winton has said something about Sir so-and-so Campbell, and treats this as weird, but we don't really know how Sir so-and-so Campbell actually thought about it. And the earliest Gaelic source that we have for it comes from, your sort of period, 16th century and later. So, 200 years removed from the individual in question. So it's hard, I think, certainly I find it hard to talk kind of authoritatively about how individuals at the time might have perceived these things. In terms, though, of those that the kind of shared values, if you like, between these cultures, at the end of the day, warfare is warfare, and the specific ways that these things get dressed up do change from place to place, but there are certain principles that you kind of can't get away from. You can't have somebody being very effective in war if they aren't pretty brave, and they're not going to last very long if they don't at least pay some degree of lip service to prudence. And don't have, not everybody raises the willingness to run away and fight another day to quite the extent that Barbour does, but sooner or later, anyone who is interested in practical and effective warfare is going to have to address the fact that you're not going to win every time. And you have to build some kind of framework for explaining and or excusing why we just ran for it.
I often think of it that if the Highlands was like a good country for like heavy cavalry, we'd never have the conversation about whether or not the Gaels had knighthood or not.
Yeah,
it's literally just the aesthetic of how they actually approach battle is what makes it somewhat ambiguous. But really, apart from that, not much.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And it sort of cuts both ways. It's interesting for Scotland because I think a lot, when I tell people that I work on Scottish chivalry, particularly people from out with Scotland, they go, "Oh, was there any Scottish chivalry?" And it comes down to the fact that in people's minds, what they think, the image that they have when they think of, say, Robert the Bruce, is Angus MacFadden in Braveheart. They're imagining someone who is swaddled in tartan and is, you know, unkempt hair, unkempt beard, unwashed, doesn't look like, you know, a knight, doesn't look what they think a knight should look like. The perceptions in the medieval period at the time, and frankly the reality of, you know, how Bruce sought to present himself is obviously quite a bit different. But, you know, when I say it cuts both ways, I think it's, you know, Scotland as a whole is looked at as being not you know, a place where chivalry is easily, you know, sits very easily with people's impression of the kingdom, the you know, the medieval realm, but also within Scotland, that Highland Lowland divide, that English speaking and Gaelic speaking divide. Again, when people think of Gaelic Scotland, the image that they get in their head is just very different than the, you know, like the image of chivalrous hero and Catherine or Gaelic speaking 14th century soldier don't kind of gel together, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, self-replicating sadly. So I was like,
yeah. Again, I hope that goes somewhere answering your question. I worry that for each of these questions I've just talked for a long time and not actually gone anywhere. Or my answer to all the questions is it's kind of complicated.
We actually only have a couple of minutes left of our sort of allotted time. So I think I'll go to Ethan's question if that's okay. But then after that, it's up to Callum. If you are not in a rush to get off, anybody that wants to hang out after that, I can stay on. And if Callum wants to stay on, we can hang out and ask. I know I have a few questions, but I didn't want to butt in while we have a good discussion going. So anybody that kind of wants to hang out, but we'll take Ethan's question first, if you don't mind, Todd.
Hi, Callum. Thanks for that, Matt. I really enjoyed it. I just had a question about your thoughts on Robert Stewart or Robert II's martial experiences and how those might have impacted Barbour's account on prudence and, as you said, the prudence of at times running away. So Robert Stewart obviously faces some recrimination about abandoning the field at the Battle of Durham in 1346, both in Scottish and English sources. I think the Lanercost chronicler basically calls him worthless at one point, and calls him an old man in deeds. Is there a sense that perhaps Barbour is trying to exonerate Robert Stewart and said, oh, you were doing the right thing, you were showing wit, governing your martial spirit by essentially leaving the field that day, whereas, you know, David II and the other Scottish nobles who stayed there were essentially not showing wit in their practice of warfare? Is there a sense that essentially Barbour is writing to his audience knowing what has happened in this man's past and saying, oh, it's all right, you did the right thing by running away?
Yeah, absolutely I do. I think, you know, even down to, I mean, I mentioned in the paper that we have this kind of interesting dichotomy between, this interesting comparison rather between Robert Bruce and Edward Bruce. You know, they are both great men, you know, the two of the finest knights of their generation, undoubtedly two of the heroes of this poem. They achieve phenomenal things. You know, they are the last two people you want to face on the battlefield. But Robert Bruce is better than Edward Bruce because Edward Bruce just goes for it, hell for leather, you know, no questions asked, no task too difficult. Robert, though, has measure, has wit, and allows that to guide his hardiness so that it can hit hardest where it will be most effective, kind of thing. And I think that there is an argument to be said. I think I would probably step back from it a little bit, but I think there is something to be said for seeing this almost as analogous to Robert Stewart and Edward Bruce. Robert Bruce as Robert Stewart and Edward Bruce as David II. You know, the younger, virile, you know, effective and, you know, kingly, knightly, you know, glorious character who's just a little bit off.
Not sensible enough.
Yeah. And I mean, the reason, I mean, I think there's something to it. I think the other comparison that can be made is between Robert Stewart and John Stewart, Earl of Carrick, his heir, who's hardly young. I mean, at the time Barbour is writing, it must be about 35, and is increasingly taking the lead role in you know, acting as the king's cipher, because of course the king's in his mid-50s by this point. In fact, he's pushing 60 by the time Barbour's writing. You know, John Stewart, the future Robert III, is increasingly acting as the king's main agent in leading this, you know, and coordinating this effort to recover the English Pale. So again, there is Edward Bruce is almost a cipher for any young member of the royal family who is eager to get stuck in to this exciting and adventurous and, you know, potentially glory-filled and renown-building conflict, Anglo-Scottish conflict, but just being told, you know, pull the reins in, hang back on it, and above it all, of course, sits Robert Stewart's grandfather, in whom I'm reasonably confident we are expected to see Robert Stewart himself sitting above it all and being the, you know, the wise man who knows when to act and knows when not to act, you know, and to whom all of these young and impetuous knights ought to be looking for their lead, as it were.
Yeah, I think, yeah, you've touched on it. I think in your PhD thesis, you touched on it, how each of the main characters are kind of literary creations embodying different ideals of warfare and what should be practiced, and, you know, prudence being exercised by Robert Bruce, but not necessarily by Edward Bruce, and then Thomas Randolph being the exemplar of someone who's able to learn from those around him and change his practices, and then James Douglas being the example of the perfect archetypal knight, you know, as he touched on, you know, being the perfect kind of exemplar of that patronage service nexus. Yeah, great stuff, mate. It's really early morning here, and I'm not a morning person, so
yeah,
thanks for joining us.
that you've come in for another time, so thank you.
No worries. Thanks, mate.
Great. In that case, then I'll sort of cut off here and say thank you so much again to Callum for that amazing talk.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much to everyone who joined us and everyone who's hung around. We are like right at the end of our time, so thank you so much to everyone who's come. Our next talk is going to be the 11th of March, so the same time, same place, Thursday, 7 p.m. and it's going to be Irene McMillan, and she is part of the Historical and Archives Society, and she's going to be doing a kind of deep dive into Dundonald Castle's history, so that'll be really interesting. And if you missed any bits of this, or if there are any talks that you have missed of ours that you'd like to watch, they're all available if you're a member of Friends of Dundonald Castle. If you're not a member, please sign up. You can do that on our website. It's really affordable. You get all of our online content on our website, and when we're open again, you get free entry to the castle all the time. So I promise you it's well worth it. Have a look. You can sign up on our website. And thanks again to Callum.
Thank you, guys.
Again, Callum, if you don't mind hanging out for a few minutes, and if it's okay with you, Kirsty, and we'll just hang out for a little bit, and Callum can answer any lingering. I still have a couple questions, and I know Todd has a question, so we'll have kind of an after session for anyone else that has questions.
you want me to go, Blythe? Or?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. It was just probably jogged my memory because you mentioned Steve Boardman, and he talks about how Andrew Winton had said and bringing it back into Dundonald, when Robert II died, Winton says he died in his own country, which Steve Boardman said was a bit of a strange kind of analogy for a king of Scots.